to the exhibition. Bit of housekeeping. There are toilets just over there through that doorway if anyone needs to go. We'll have about a 30-minute chat. Questions during the talk is more than welcome. In fact, encouraged. I would much rather not hear my voice the entire time. So if there's any burning questions, please do throw them out there. We will then finish off with another round of just general conversation and questions too. So Karl, would you like to start without introducing the show?
Okay, so my name is Karl Halliday, curator. We're both based in Melbourne, and we're very pleased to be here. It's a privilege to be on Dunne country for Countersights. The exhibition, Mahady and I, kind of conceived putting together an exhibition that originally was going to look at the idea of site specificity, or the relationship between photography and site, or photography and place. And when thinking about other kind of artistic mediums, we think about painting, we think about sculpture, think about
land art even.
Sure, yeah. I mean, throughout the 20th century, this idea that art belonged in galleries and it was nomadic, it could be moved between spaces and it wouldn't change its meaning, was kind of the dominant idea. And it wasn't until maybe the 70s that this idea of site specificity come into play, in which the context becomes part of the content. Photography is quite different as a medium in that it's reproducible, and so it can exist in multiple different contexts at multiple different times to multiple different audiences. And that context is going to inform what kind of meanings are possible to be drawn out from the photograph and its placement. And so in thinking about the situation, the site of a photograph is very much shapes what is possible in terms of the meanings that can be gleaned. When we were looking at a bunch of Australian artists that were kind of, whose practices dealt with some of these concerns, we realized that a really overriding concern was around how, I guess, the role that photography's played in the imagination of Australia and the landscape. For instance, we might all have an idea or a concept of what the outback looks like in our head, but the outback isn't any one place. It's kind of like a mythology or something kind of more symbolic. And but it's still very much foundational to our national identity. And this is something that I think a lot of, the kind of Western perspectives that photography brings has a kind of colonial undertone or attitude to it. A lot of that's been drawn out of Western landscape painting and this idea of having sovereignty over landscape by being able to map it and being able to depict it and to represent it as a kind of conquering almost. And so many of the artists that we were kind of looking at were kind of looking at ways of disrupting and subverting and looking at alternative ways of thinking about landscape through photography by kind of hijacking the medium and exploring those other possibilities. So I suppose maybe we can start with some of the works that we have outside. We're not going to have you out here in the sun too long. We'll move inside shortly. But Mahady, do you want to talk about Matt Dunne's work?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is 1080 by Matt Dunne. It's a recent project of his that he's still currently working through with the possibility of a photo book in the near future. But when we first spoke to Matt and and inviting him to be a part of the project, we were very interested in how his practice is quite considerate around environmental conservation and looking into some of the different politics and languages that are being used around agriculture and how that is quite a significant form of industry for Australia. During his time travelling across the region, he's managed to also look into specifically these dingo-proof fences and looking into how there's been this systematic culling of dingoes, but actually using the terminology of wild dogs as that to avoid any form of native animal sort of restrictions. And he's been going through many different peoples and relationships and processes into looking at how exactly the dingo culling has been enacted, where exactly these locations are, and even looking into some of the poetic uses of demarcation and how we actually respond to these static objects and how we maneuver around them, which is why Karl and I were really interested in actually looking a little bit further into where people view his photographic works, if they would be either outside or inside or perhaps both. And we believed that like being able to start the process of entering the gallery space shouldn't actually be as soon as you enter the door, and that there is always going to be some form of physical recentering that you will need to do in order to consider where exactly you're standing within a particular site. So even being able to start with these sort of fence posts and having these be more of the introductory terminology and ideas for people before they enter the space. And you'll also see a few more of Matt's works scattered throughout the gallery as well. Yeah, and we'll also now start going through and have a bit of a look at everybody else's works in there.
Come on indoors.
Before we go on to everybody's physical art objects here in the space, I also want to just draw your eyes and attention to some of the texts that are scattered across each of the different walls and floors. These are text contributions done by a local Noble Wall writer, Mackenzie Lee, who Karl and I had commissioned to respond to the ideas within counter sites. We both believed that this was a very important relationship to have within the gallery space and with each of the artworks, not only because of the relationship that the photograph and text really has with one another, but also inviting this sort of this digested and then regurgitated knowledge and ideas of what each of the different photographers and artists are being presenting here in the space. And also quite commonly there are usually just A4 sheets of paper that are being printed out and passed out for people to just read and consume and then just flow through the rest of the exhibition space. But we felt that it was very important to really, again, remind people where exactly they're positioning themselves within the gallery and taking these sorts of mindful movements between each of the different texts and how they may or may not respond to the artworks that are associated around it. It's a very beautiful, full extended text though, and it is available on the website to read if that is something that you are interested in. And I would definitely recommend that. So.
Now these beautiful two large prints here by Isabella Capezio. Isabella Capezio is actually from Canberra, it's really here, but is now based in Melbourne, teaches at RMIT, and has long had a photography practice around the idea of queering landscapes. And, for instance, they just completed a PhD show that explored camouflage and this, like, how our bodies can even, mask and blend in with our environments and what that means. And hilariously, she came to the opening in a ghillie suit, like one of these military suits, coming through with a camera. The two works that we have here, one's made with a camera, one's made without a camera. So this is called Upside Down Country. It was taken on Jahkarli land in kind of near Castlemaine in Victoria, which there's a lot of gold mining that happened around that area. And it's called Upside Down Country because that's what the local indigenous population referred to it, because of this upheaval of the land and the destruction that comes with the extractive practicing of mining. For Bella, this idea of an extraction or mining where you remove the surface and there's these other kind of layered surfaces that become revealed or concealed underneath is a metaphor for photography itself. And in this instance, this is actually the site where the world's largest piece of gold ore was discovered in 1897. It was so large, it was something like 70 kilos, that they had to use an anvil to break it in 3 pieces just to be able to weigh it. And it's a pretty incredible story, but also one that looks at how mining and these extractive practices have influenced and shaped and destroyed landscapes. And that is articulated in a different way with this image, which is called Welcome Stranger, which was actually the name of the gold nugget that was found. Welcome Stranger, such a strange title. And in this instance, Bella's actually submerged the film in water from a deep cut mine in WA. And this is all of the pollution in the water caused from the mining that has actually developed onto the surface of the film. So she's found a really beautiful poetic metaphor to be able to express this, I suppose, intervention that mining and colonization and settlement has had on the landscape that continues very much to this day. So, fantastic works.
And just opposite is Jahkarli.
If you wish to come around.
Romanis' work here. Jahkarli is a woman and has also just recently completed her PhD, which is titled Disconnected to Country, in which for the last few years she has been reconnecting with her own ancestral ties to Pita country and having a quite collaborative process of working with her family and her community and looking into some of the very important sites of Pita country. But then there was also this really interesting realization that came through, which was that a lot of maps that we actually have now, particularly satellite mapping devices or software, and including like Google Maps and Google Earth, there is no real marking or signification of where exactly First Nations land is. And so what Jahkarli had decided to do from that process was essentially steal some of the Google Earth satellite images, screenshot them, and was able to then produce these almost glitches within the landscape and showing this form of disruption, but also this return or stealing, I guess, back of what the image of the land is and what exactly it means, particularly to her and her family. And there was a really, these have been presented through on light boxes to, I guess, like reinforce that level of digital sort of dissonance that comes from how we perceive the landscape, not only from our physical surroundings, but also from the screens itself. And that's a very important consideration, I think, to also have when we're looking at this exhibition as a whole. You know, there are so many different ways for us to respond or even consume and understand and reflect on how we identify with ourselves amongst landscape or site itself, and then even digital sites. So it was a really important, I think, contribution to the show, and even having seen the way that Bella's work with the glass can sometimes even have this reflected imagery and this sort of interesting relationship that then sort of correlates between, you know, the extractive nature that has come from these very intensely Western sort of processes and practices around mining, extracting, and even digital mining and extracting.
I would like to add to that, you know, maybe one of the things you'll notice about the exhibition is that we haven't actually, we've designed it in such a way that we haven't really said whose work is whose. And sometimes they kind of blend together, and there's a little bit of ambiguity there because there's these wonderful resonances and rhymes between some of the different practices where there's a kind of consistent theme. And this was, you know, we can take some of the credit for that as curators, but also, you know, it was also happenstance that the artists put together works that actually had this wonderful kind of correlation. And one of the wonderful things about Jahkarli's works that I think is kind of important to mention is that in thinking about like Western ways of thinking and Western ways of seeing, at least since the Renaissance, it's been dominated by this idea of single point perspective. And this is very common in painting, where it suggests that everything kind of recedes into a horizon line, a single point, and you're placed in the center of this world, and it's like an ideal position. But this ideal position suggests that there's a right or a correct way of viewing the world, and that you're in the center of it. And this, completely negates other ways of looking. It assumes an ideal. And this kind of horizon line has for a long time been the kind of driving force behind cartography, and cartography is a colonial practice. And in a wonderful essay by Karl, the German artist, she talks about how we've now entered a new paradigm in which we no longer relate to the world as bodies from the horizon line, but rather from a bird's eye point of view. And this is something that Google Maps has made possible. And indeed, in Jahkarli's works, she disrupts that by actually obscuring the horizon line, especially in this wonderfully vertiginous kind of image. It feels like you're falling, about to go splat. And it's the same with Matt Dunne's works too, which you'll notice that because there are images on both sides, there is no single position in which you can see the whole of the work at once. You can only see it from multiple positions. And so this would reinforce this idea that there is no single point or like kind of master narrative, but rather something that's a lot more situational, depending on where you stand and how you relate to the work. Yeah. So we'll continue through the other side here. So on these walls we have works by Mahady, who is a Melbourne-based photographer, and his work probably stands out in the show as being the least tied to this kind of like colonial point of view, which, these kind of post-colonial concerns are a big aspect of looking at the relationship between photography and place, but it's only one of many avenues in which this exhibition addresses that, and I think Nicholas looks at it from more of a conceptual point of view. For Nicholas, he's really interested in this idea of being able to use the most realistic of mediums, photography, to be able to somehow visualize or articulate the invisible. And he describes them as micro-atmospheres. And I think that's a really great example of thinking about how photography is kind of dislocated. It doesn't have any one place. The way in which it circulates and where we see it and the different contexts that it can exist. Resonate in that this is the interior of a car glove box compartment, and Nicholas actually made a series of these, and you can't even tell what kind of car it is, where it could kind of exist. It's a really liminal kind of image that kind of this like weird in-between space. I've never seen a photograph of something like this before. Next to it is this is actually a sound reduction system from a museum. It was taken kind of like behind the walls. They had these large kind of acoustic absorbent equipment, and again, this kind of like the hidden and the things that we don't usually see. And Nicholas's practice, even in the way in which he frames it, and he's very particular about the framing and the presentation, and essentially what to exclude and what to include, which is the principle of photography, right? It's always defined by the frame, and that frame is kind of directs our attention, or determines what's valuable, what's worth our attention. And I guess Nicholas turns it onto things that we would probably otherwise ignore. Next to this are these two car glove box compartments that have been kind of inverted and perverted, per se, in which he's subtly flocked them on the outside. This is like this kind of felt material. Sometimes you get it in like wardrobe clothes irons. And on the outside, where usually it's felted on the inside, so it's this kind of like obsolete object. There's something kind of surreal about it, as well as placing the image of a car glove box interior next to these car glove boxes. Is this weird kind of like tension, and that's something that you find with a lot of like really site-specific photography, when the photograph kind of substitutes the thing and then it's placed next to the thing. It's just this wonderful kind of tension between them.
And so we really like his work for the way in which I guess it theoretically addresses abuse.
Absolutely, and I guess in like a complete contrast to that, with Christine McFetridge's work here, it's very much tied to a very specific location and a very specific point in time of so-called Australian history. Recently completing her PhD as well, which is called An Inconvenient Curve. Christine has gone through very meticulous research into the Coutts Report, which is a document that talks about and argues for the exploding of the Birrong Maher and looking at how this would actually help benefit the Melbourne CBD at that time, and in order to improve the industrialisation of that city space. And so through that process of reading and understanding and even trying to find ways to unlearn this practice that has been so embedded into our history and archives, Christine has decided to subvert and even retort, I guess, parts of what Coutts has specified within his own work, and looking at what exactly do we place value in as part of the archive and the documentation of this, you know, and very much reinforcing actually the specific relationships that we as bodies have with other materials and matter, specifically with the basalt rocks here. And I guess similarly to how Nicholas Mahady is looking at what exactly do we prioritize and put within the frame of what's been possibly seen as just mundane or arbitrary, we then see that Christine has followed this similar sort of language, and by really platforming and even highlighting the art object and giving it that sort of prominence within these sorts of gallery spaces too. And there was a conversation that we had where it was very important to really actually almost mock the idea of the white cube space, which has been very much the common or even like the most idolized form of art presentations, which is quite an interesting approach in looking at site specificity. When there is a white cube, what exactly does that then mean? Because you're actually producing meaning within that space, but that doesn't necessarily always mean that, I guess, in that sort of way. And so we have here the actual map of the Birrong Maher that was used in the report, and using a overhead projector for this. And we had discussed as well, particularly looking at even having the basalt rocks being projected or shadowing over the front of the map to sort of retain or reinforce this sort of like influence of and the prominence of the material itself that was being threatened of being extracted and removed. And then there have been these reports here which might not necessarily feel or obviously look photographic, but I believe is actually a really important aspect of photography in its theory, and looking at more so photography as a document and looking at ways of negotiating the power within the archive. And you can see here that she's taken the original reports from Coutts and has actually changed some of the language that's been used, reinforcing or reiterating how this is a very particular position that has been taken place in that period of time, very white-centric, capitalist in mindset, and trying to find ways in which we can dissect that language and that document to find new approaches of learning and understanding our environments.
I think, one of the things about the exhibition is we're not only interested in photography in terms of the technical aspect of the kind of images that it could make, but we're also interested in how it's being used. And I think, these kind of archival practices are definitely one big part of that. You'll notice, perhaps on the side of this plinth, part of Mackenzie's text says, that tripod looks an awful lot like a rifle. And indeed, the camera as a technology accelerated because of World War II, and in thinking about, like developing these technologies and imaging technologies as a way of, with, finer and finer resolution. And indeed, even the terminology and the language that we use around photography is very much reminiscent of these kind of militaristic terms. We aim, we shoot, we capture. And so inevitably, we're thinking about the way in which the camera there's a kind of violence to it. The fact that we don't even we take photographs, and there's an extraction there, or some kind of even, feels like almost like a theft. So, this kind of like dominion of the landscape and so forth, I think, it's really well articulated through Christine's practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about this. As well.
So this was at the very front here, sorry, a brief of paper that says, "Dear patron, regrets unable to supply map 2 as it is missing from the book, highly fragile and binding its damage." Christine had requested to look at a particular document and map that is quite similar to the one that is here being projected. But unfortunately, due to the fragility of the document, this was actually just an email that she had received from the archivists to say that it was not a form of knowledge or information that she would be able to receive, look at, consume, and to then also present to other people. And this is very much in that sort of conversation about the photographic document of what we frame and what we don't frame, and showing how powerful it is to also, I guess, retract information, and to even see where points of archives can even have these gaps of history and other voices within them.
At the end here, these two sentinels, as the artist called them, by Rebecca McCauley and Aaron Karl, they're both based in WA. These are video monitors that have been installed with our seat headrests. And again, this is one of those kind of rhymes I was talking about. We have two different components of cars, in the space facing one another. And these are both slideshows of, it's kind of a mix of Google Maps images of various colonial monuments that are scattered throughout Australia. So a few years ago, Aaron and Rebecca, they travelled around the entirety of Australia, they circumnavigated it, and found that along these kind of routes that were the major highways connecting cities that were actually once indigenous trails, but have been since renamed, and the kind of knowledge of that has been erased or made invisible. There's about 80,000 or something crazy like that. These little tiny statues, plaques, monuments, commemorations to colonial explorers, which they've interspersed here with these wonderful screenshots from 1980s Australian car ads, where you find the Holdens barreling through the red desert of Australia, and again, this is just really a testament to the kind of construct of the invention of the outback as an image, and how cars and moving through space is very much a big part of that. And the work continues through in this room.
The East Coast. They celebrate invention to map trillions of streets across the world.
So whereas the images on the headrests outside were all fine images, these images were taken by the artist and produced on the slides. And on top of the slides, there is an audio kind of conversation between two artists, Aaron and Rebecca, and many of the kind of fragments of their conversation have come from conversations with people that they've met on country and traveling through the space.
A body holds memory.
The duration that it takes for the slide carousel to reset does not match that of the audio, and so sometimes they come into sync by accident. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, right? Or sometimes they kind of go out of sync, and so it's very situational in terms of what kind of experience you have depending on when you enter the space. There's no kind of beginning or end.
beneath
It's this
the
kind of
water,
constant cycle.
follow the whales on the way out.
Another way in which they kind of address the idea of sight in their practice is also thinking about the body of sight. And not in terms of just simply our position in space, but indeed even our physical characteristics as individuals. And so the two headrests out there are actually at different heights. Those are the eye heights of the artists. And thinking about how even that will determine perspective and the kind of framing of the world we see. And they're really interested in looking at ways of other ways of looking and other ways of thinking about landscape through photography.
Scars that honor the names of the first white.
It also makes it great sound. The slide projector
Of tens of thousands of monuments erected across the country proclaims a sort of hollow endurance.
we're talking about like
They
the
seem
violence
untended,
of the
a
camera
ubiquitous
to
roadside backdrop to public rest stops and picnic tables.
reloading, you know, of a gun sound that's really happening too in some way.
Man, with no experience or skills in surveying or navigation, set out in a party of four, headed north.
It's a wonderful work, and I really encourage you to take some time on it and enjoy it. It doesn't go for too long. I think it's about 5-6 minutes.
And street names.
In Germany, you make photos, you don't take photos. Yeah, so a lot of German
You can see
people.
Like in the language.
Yeah.
vegetation.
So I'm just
The soft
wondering
air
if you
overlay
like
of four
know
holes
whether
and
there's
little
a
dots
split
across the
where
screen.
taking photos
The
kind
space
of
between
that
them,
ownership
the width of a finger,
maybe split
more than a
between
full day's
German and
walk.
English. I don't know, but.
One after another, they trace very old stories.
I think it also kind of responds to the idea of authorship in photography, because you wouldn't say you could take a painting or you take a sculpture. This idea of taking something means that it's very much dependent on the program of the camera and thinking about how
and how they
something like the camera makes the image for you, and so you're not the one making it. But photography, of course, does not necessarily have to be a film negative image or something culled from a digital sensor on your phone. It can exist in other kind of ways. And some of the earliest kinds of photography for the invention of film and camera explored that. Photography kind of existed as an idea before it existed as a technology. And maybe it's something to do with that, but that's interesting,
Here's
isn't
what we know.
it?
The road cuts like a knife.
Any other questions?
There's an insinuation before.
Consider the
that
telegraph
one of the
poles,
artworks hadn't been
tracing the
completed.
path
One of
walked
the
for a
art's
very
been
long
selected, but
time.
the artwork hadn't been completed.
The routes that early colonial explorers set
Which
out
was
to
about the
dance
migration.
on, and the petrol
Like,
stations
I
are
guess,
now
like,
marked their course.
There's a lot of
The fleets of
even like
fluorescent
Bella's
flashing
work
lights
is more
that
of an
pave
ongoing
these journeys
project, and
over
that
and over,
some
faster
of the
and faster,
images
until the distance between here
weren't
and there has shrunk to the
completely
size of a holiday
before curating
or
the
a weekend
artists.
away.
So we were very much like having initial conversations with them and talking about what our, I guess, curatorial intentions were and how we
Prospector,
were considering
male,
the show itself.
travelling alone,
And I mean, even
heading
both
east in
Karl and I
search of
were
a spectrum
from
dot.
Canberra.
He
This
handed
is
us a
one of
meteorite
our
and
first
asked,
real
"Have you ever
involvement
seen a
in
rock like this?"
and having to really sort of like ad hoc some of the ideas, I guess, of like how some
I
of the
think it
images are
broke
going to be
trains
represented in the
lit up at
space.
night like
But
Christmas
then
trees.
once being here,
With the tarmac
trying
and
to
burnt
decide
rubber.
how some of the
The
relationships
rumbling sound of
might
the
be able
engines
to
in
work
the
together.
distance. The scream of the
I
brakes
think in
when
particular with Matt's work, he
What it means to
had
mark a
said
place,
specifically that he had
memory,
something
and
over like
image.
40,000 images that he
how
had
the cost
taken
and
for the
availability
project.
of ice cream
And
fluctuates relative to
that
truck
would just
routes,
be a ridiculous archive to
tourist
have to go
buses,
through first
and how many caravans
in
pass
order to
through.
really decide which images would
It
work
allows
best.
the evidence of my past
So I guess
and
with
my
that
future,
we actually just
wrapped in a
said to
northern
him,
chip packet.
please only like maybe give us like 30 and we can go from there.
And hold them down to 10,000.
Let's just funnel it down just a little bit, please. And I guess, and he in particular, I guess, because I was having quite a few conversations with him, he was very interested in how this project is going to be having multiple iterations across this year. There's going to be a few other exhibitions of that work, and trying to find how certain images are going to correlate with one another, or also how
We
it's going to
branded
be
our cars
responding
with
to
stolen
other artists'
language.
works as well.
To run, to fly,
And
Knowledge of the
We
land
should also mention that this is
turned
perhaps
into
only the first
configuration
iteration
alignments
of this
and
exhibition.
culture.
It's something that we would like to kind of extend and
Machines,
continue the
marketing,
conversation, maybe look at a
lexicon,
publication down the track,
national
and kind of develop some of
collapse
these kind of
into
conversations that
uplands.
come out of it. So in that sense, yeah, it's never finished when you're banned. Yes.
I noted that a lot of these photos were annotated,
Imagine
and a lot
stockmen
of
and
the,
drovers
like even
tailgating a
this
fleet
photo
of
with like
dummies and
faceless
jump ups
humans.
up the human highway,
I'm just wondering,
passing each
like,
other as they stop for snacks.
in the sense of not wanting
Caravans called
to
conquest,
destroy
crusade,
even more of the
making their way
culture
around the
that
country.
exists in our country
Suburban
as
people
a
movers named after the
ancestor
outback.
of colonial people. How do I
Convoys
live
of vehicles
in
named
this
as a way to stake
land?
claim.
Which is not a question
The
that
perpetual
I'm
build-up of
expecting an
rubble.
answer to, but maybe
Or
how do
slippery after
you
the first
respect the
rain.
land while still having that ancestry?
I think it's a very individual
We
answer,
manufactured our
and
cars for
that
comfort and
perhaps
safety.
that is
We designed them to
quite
go
a
faster,
prominent
to be made
question
faster.
that a lot of these
We've
artists
made it
are
easier
actually
than ever before to
considering
separate
themselves.
material from its ancestry.
Particularly like with Christine's
forget
work
where it
and
came
how
from.
she's very much
We put
quite
TVs in the back
open
seat to make
about
the
her
time pass
colonial
faster still.
ancestry and very much talking
The
about this
earth within these
unlearning and
strands glows
decentering
with
of
the same
white
heartburn
Western
of the
knowledge.
desert. Its soft
And then even
phosphorescence
with Rebecca and
reconstituted
Aaron's
from
work,
the sand
very
of
much
the desert
having this
elsewhere.
collaborative again, very relational sort of like work practice and talking to people and trying to find new ways of learning and understanding
heard of a man,
through
Almost
conversation.
14,
And
obsessed with the
that's
idea
then
of an
even
inland
in
sea.
Matt's work and how he's had to have
Following
many
the
different
pelicans,
conversations
he
with
set out
conservationists,
upstream.
ecologists, even farmers and even lawyers and things like that. To be able to be mindful that there is always
The
more to
meteorite
learn
felt
and know
heavy and
from other
smooth in
people
my hand.
first.
I think about
and
the stories it has carried
allowing
across
that
the
sort of
sky,
vulnerability to be
and
accepted.
the type of man you must mold yourself
and
into
just
to
be
race into space.
to allow it to be exposed.
I think
guess,
about
in some
belonging.
way.
What your question raises is, it's got me thinking about really being able to show us about this idea of an ethics of photography. And I mean, as a photographer myself, one of the things that draws me to the medium is this idea that if we all had a camera right now and we were all in a room and we were all tasked to photograph a bouquet of flowers, we're all going to photograph it differently. Why? And we can even photograph it in contradictory ways. But no point of view is any less valid than the other. And so I think it's an incredible tool for empathy as well, and showing kind of other ways of seeing that may be different from your own, but are equally legitimate.
Set out to accomplish the objective he had in view, or perish in the attempt. A pattern of disappointment followed him.
Great
and he
exhibition.
found the journey
I was wondering,
unbelievable.
like, what's the end game
5 men
for
had
like
left the pack horses found
colonisation?
good water
Like, is
here.
it, what's the,
My brother, please.
I've got,
I love it.
I haven't got universities like to study art or anything, so I'm just trying to understand like what does it mean? Like, is it
remembers.
just performative, or is it like, is it actually like, is it just revolutionaries without revolution, or is it actually trying to change? Is there going to be any substantial?
That's a very good question, and I think it's a very big question.
The sky above,
And you know,
satellites and planes.
I don't know about speculating, but I do think, I mean, Mahady and I, when we were traveling to Canberra, we were thinking about,
In the palm of your hand.
just given the nature of the show, thinking about situation, you know, what is the significance of having the show in the capital of our country, the belly of the beast? And
Gives you
I think over the last, you know, kind of 20, 30 years, one thing that we've kind of experienced as a culture is we've challenged all these traditional ideas around identity. So it might be sexuality, gender, things about age and ableism and race. But the one kind of form of identity that we've still very much anchored to is this idea of national identity. And that's something that, you know, Canberra became very symbolic of. And this idea that, you know, to belong to a place and to feel welcome within a situation and the kind of entitlement that comes with that. I think the future will really involve just acknowledgement and a conscientiousness and a consideration of many of the dramas, that especially in a place like Australia, where people experience, and finding ways to reconcile that.
freight route
to
to Port Kembla. To all
yeah,
the
but in authentic ways. Because you know what? There is a lot.
into the shape of the harbour bridge.
Absolutely, and there is a lot of tokenism. And although I think that
hand-driven rivets holding it
that
together, and the
doesn't
thousands
come
of
from a
pieces
bad
of
place,
digital
I don't think
images
it's the
of
most authentic way of
imaginary
living and
clouds
moving
and
forward.
warehouses of
It ultimately comes down to
each
conversation,
new structure
dialogue,
leaving
and
an absence of
understanding.
wake.
I think photography is a
What
great
happens
tool
to the town when
for allowing us to
stops?
do that.
And I think also it's allowing that discomfort to be experienced. I think there is a lot of
Former Shira,
people
male,
who
spent
feel
the last
like
fortnight in the water.
there is
Heading back west.
there is like
stopped me and
quiet
said,
security around
"That's the
always
most
wanting to be
jumpy you've got there,
comfortable
mate.
and
Packer, is
not
it?"
wanting to try and make a change without that maybe always looking
Man,
good. I
early
think that
20s,
there is, you
lived
know,
halfway around the
a
world after
humility
seeing a video on TikTok.
in enduring that sort of
Weeks into the
discomfort
job,
and
he
allowing
told
that
us stories to know
unsettling
about the history of freight
feeling
fishing
in
in that
your own
town.
body, because again it's also that experience of empathy, because there has just been a significant amount of trauma and discomfort that has been imposed onto other
Here's what we
people,
know. Fantasy
and
is a place
there is a lot of acknowledged but also unacknowledged privileges I think that everybody does have in some way or another, and that
It's
having
the
to
way we
sort
circulate our
of
images,
acknowledge
plastering them beside them on
those
ramps and off ramps,
discrepancies within yourself
disseminating them
is
through paid
also a
partnerships
really
and advertising
important
campaigns.
process
The whole process,
before
its own
actually
algorithm,
really going
molding
through
our
some of
collective
the
memory.
much harder questions
There's
around
even a street sign for it,
decolonisation.
the one with the camera.
I think
It
that
helps to direct your
an
gaze.
end game is kind
Coherence
of
workshop at time,
kind of a
feedback
moot
loop of
point,
culture.
because there is also
Meetups,
always an
forums,
opportunity for
live
change
streams,
to occur,
festivals,
and that
geotags,
there always
movies,
needs
and
to be
in-flight magazines.
a level of
Placemaking for a new
discernment
future.
around what change, positive or negative, will occur. And I would say that quite a lot of the artists in this exhibition are also
Her mobility demands
making
growth
some
as each
form,
new
or at
margin
least
goes
for me,
larger and further away.
a lot of these artists
The
I have
frontier
found
shifts,
to
but the
really
method stays the same.
understand that
We
level of
shift.
discomfort
No,
and
we
having
learn
to
the work
try
is
and
so that we can
acknowledge that for
ourselves
themselves
again.
first.
I think the exhibition's a great way of looking at it in that it establishes that photography is a problematic medium. But that doesn't mean that we should throw away the camera.
Polar bears.
We should just learn to use
Places
it
already
differently.
known, renamed. Hardship and struggle. UFO sightings. Farmhouse
There's
postcards.
no other questions. Totally happy for us to just have little chit chats.
And thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Yeah,
No, I mean,
really
yeah.
appreciate it.
And then the final word is-
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and thank you for your
last
wonderful
6 weeks
questions.
with
Yeah,
Mum.
really
Told
appreciate
us
it.
it's not easy being off the tools.
Well, take some time to absorb the show.